Good evening, audience. Today I have an interesting essay to share with you. We are going to discuss the Old Testament of the Bible, and we're going to discuss it for your own good, and not even in a religious or a theological manner. Doesn't matter if you are a Christian, atheist, or one of those undecided Gnostic fence-sitters. I am compelled to write this because so many people fail to comprehend how much our current epoch rhymes with the history of the ancient Hebrews of the Bible. Nothing happening at present is particularly surprising if you've read and comprehended the Old Testament, even at a basic level. So, at an earlier time, a few years ago, the Bible used to be a book I'd read if I wanted to catch some Z's. I want to have a sleep. Long meandering sentences, old irrelevant chronologies, back to Methuselah, stories about some people a long time ago. I wasn't able to grasp how the connotations of this seemingly outdated book could apply to me. For I am the modern cosmopolitan man, I would think. I am a cut above the dim-witted savages of past millennia. The days of pastoral existence and primitivism are long gone. Man has shrugged off his barbaric tendencies as though they were a worn-out cloak and stepped into a new resplendent suit fashioned from our new enlightened age of high technology. Technological marvels that would have appeared supernatural to our earlier forebears. But that isn't correct. It only took a few hours of reading to realize the error of my reasoning. The lessons in the Bible still apply to us. Not only has humanity failed to evolve beyond the basal instincts, desires, and weaknesses that shaped the journeys of our ancestors in the Old Testament, our species even possesses the arrogance to believe our new created religion, that of science, discounts the lessons of morality and consequence detailed within these events. The Old Testament provides an excellent snapshot of the history of humanity, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the forces that drive the cyclical progression. It's within these timeless truths that the divinity of the Bible becomes apparent. Only by swallowing what could be construed as my own pride, and setting aside a malingering lassitude I possessed deep within my psyche, was I able to become enlightened to the perennial wisdom contained within the Old Testament. So, the purpose of this essay is to discuss a handful of aspects of the Old Testament and how they apply to modern civilization. These aspects are not just theological, but also the philosophical and anthropological. These are aspects I find interesting. If you're testing the waters of religion, you may also find this interesting. If you're fully reborn in Christ, you will also find this interesting. But this is going to be a shallow examination. There may also be some errors in sourcing material from the Bible. Referring to Julius Evola, an infatuation with citation is the hobgoblin of a small mind. Citation is also time-intensive, and my time is not cheap. The great humorist, author Mark Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Spanish philosopher George Santayana is credited with a conjugate aphorism, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." To contemplate the lessons of the Bible is to understand the current trajectory of contemporary civilization. The Old Testament doesn't just provide a history of the first of God's people. It also demonstrates that those same people weren't above their pagan enemies in any way, and they often emulated their behaviors and cultural practices with shocking precision. In fact, they do it so often that it demonstrates either a serious problem of amnesia of past consequence or an arrogant ignorance that defies belief. A great irony is revealed in asking the atheistic and irreligious about their knowledge of the Bible. These same people that often hold great respect for symbolic texts of the classical ages of Greece and the antiquity fail to grasp that the most comprehensive symbolic historical tome is indeed the Old Testament of the Bible. Unsurprisingly, their knowledge of the Bible is typically comically limited, full of out-of-context, cherry-picked anecdotes, and opinions grafted from the latest self-proclaimed thought leader of the era. In fact, the best way to put an atheist's complaints about the Bible is simply to ask which part of the Bible he or she has read. In short, the Bible provides a long, continuous historical record of a single group of people. We see in their desires, limitations, or weaknesses the modern man largely unchanged. Taking these lessons, we can apply them to our current tumultuous age and begin to understand what drives the societal trends within our civilization. This single group of people is written of in great detail, including their cultural and religious practices, social structures, and government. These are not just provided in a static portrayal, These practices change continuously throughout the progression of the Bible, including the transition from single independent rule under Moses, the appointment of tribal judges, through to the monarchy under the kings of Israel and Judah. We also see, crucially, that, irrespective of the form of governance, the Israelites inevitably tend towards corrupt practices of idolatry and other forms of so-called sin, which erode the moral foundations of functional society and send it on a collision course with consequence. I want to start with encouraging all ADHD patients, both real and self-diagnosed, myself included, that there is an alternative to reading books. Yes, I'm aware of the epidemic of chronically short attention spans caused by the modern age of information and entertainment. We have a solution, though. It's the technology of narrative books. Audiobooks, the important ones such as the Bible, the works of Carl Jung, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and the classical texts are all available to you on YouTube, file-sharing websites, and even Amazon Audible if you have cash to burn. Are you cooking breakfast, cleaning, or doing other mindless menial tasks? Time to educate yourself. Stop being lazy. In this age of high technology, man wanders through a hedonistic wasteland of ideological mirages, clickbait philosophies, and pseudo-religious cults of self-improvement, or rather self-enrichment, peddled by ever-present false prophets. Don't fall for this garbage. Real multimillionaires, if they do have systematic wealth-making secrets, don't share these secrets. And wouldn't have the time to do either. All the best information in the world is free. So, now let's take a look at the age of this book. How old is it? This is quite a tough question, and depending on which source you look at, it could be 3,000 to 5,000 years or more. And are we talking when the stories occurred or when they were recorded? It's difficult to date things this far back without some kind of reference. We can look at famous people in the Old Testament and look for circumstantial evidence. We have an idea with Moses because the Egyptians are mentioned. There's a pharaoh, and that's either Ramses II or Seti, which are probably 1300 BC or so. Take a few steps back to Noah, and there's a great flood, which is referenced in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian king, that's Iraq, estimated to have existed around 3000 BC. Adam and Eve, forget about it. Forget about Adam and Eve. We don't know even where the Garden of Eden was, and considering how much the environment has changed in the last 10,000 years or so, we probably never will. The Old Testament is probably the oldest and most comprehensive written history of a group of humans still in existence today. Now, let's say we have an atheist in the audience, and this atheist lords a heckle. How do we know any of this is true? Well, a good question. For some pop science redditor allergic to books, how do we know anything about ancient archaeological understanding is true? Entire sections of ancient history, that is, up to 500 AD, are based on singular written records, sometimes decades or centuries after the alleged events occurred. Taking a look at Roman historians such as Marcus Terentius Varro, Cassius Dio, and Appian, known by most historians to be biased, their accounts are often reliant on gossip and hearsay. Wouldn't be very permissible today for a written record. That is, many Roman historical records were not written as first-hand accounts, and Roman historical records are considered to be amongst the best relative to other ancient civilizations. And that is just around 2,000 years ago, with nothing to speak of much earlier civilizations such as ancient Egypt and Sumer. Entire histories are extrapolated off fragments of clay or stone tablets. The pyramids of Giza, despite what you may think, do not contain ancient Egyptian pharaohs and likely never did. No records exist of their true purpose, and it's still debated to this day. Ancient history is not in any way reliable, especially more than 2,000 years ago, when the Old Testament occurs, and is taken as more and as an approximation. The most reliable tool archaeologists have is carbon dating, which tells the age of objects with carbon-based origin. Doesn't really tell you much else. If you want to learn more about that, look at the veracity of ancient historical records on Google. Say what you want about the Garden of Eden, and I will discuss that in more detail at some later time, but everything from Abraham onwards has at the very minimum relevant historical context. I find a lot of Christians have no idea what the climate was like in the Old Testament. This is a bit of a tangent, but I just want to bring this up. I would take a wild guess and say that most people think the Middle East and Sahara have always been hot and dry. This is not the case. The climate naturally changes over the course of decades, centuries, and millennia as well, due to the highly complex feedback mechanisms that exist in the Earth's oceans, atmosphere, and orbital trajectory around the Sun. The climate of the Earth is incredibly complex. None of our current models have accurately predicted what the weather's going to be like next week, let alone 10 or 100 years from now. The environment of the Sahara in the Middle East was a lot greener between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago during the African humid period. For context, the ancient Egyptian civilization started around 3000 BC, which is also 5,000 years ago. These are all estimates, of course, and I encourage you not to take climate history too seriously. It's actually very uncertain at the best of times. So with that done, I want to move on to the purpose and use of the Old Testament. I want to build on my earlier point, that of the Old Testament and how it provides a record of human civilization, what it teaches us about our contemporary world, how we got here, and where we're going. Officially, we're told the Old Testament is the story of the Israelites' Word of God, written by prophets with words either inspired by God or events witnessed firsthand, so it's meant to be divine. While its divinity is a matter of belief, there are some objective facts that support the assertion of this text being quite special. The Bible has existed, largely unchanged, save for translation, for several thousand years. The Bible contains detailed accounts of history that align well with uncovered archaeological records. The Bible contains information on human civilizations and how they form, prosper, and collapse. Its content is invaluable in the fields of psychology, sociology, and anthropology as a result. I want to contrast this with the field of science. Science is valuable to us because it provides the technology that enables our current high standard of living, information about the world around us, and limited control over future events. The useful parts of science are self-evident. Newtonian physics allows us to predict how long it will take for a falling apple to hit the Earth, and what speed it will be going prior to impact. From these laws and similar, we can build a bridge, road, or car to high specifications and reliability, know how long it will last, thereabout, and how to construct it as cheaply as possible. As marvelous as science is, these attributes do not make it divine, despite what popular science adherents would have you believe. Science fails to answer questions of the metaphysical and philosophical, such as our existence and reasons therein. Science also fails to conclusively describe our current societal trajectory and the driving factors. For those who doubt the historicity of the Old Testament, I agree on a handful of elements. I'll start at the beginning. The book of Genesis states the world was created in 7 days. On the surface, this seems kind of simplistic, especially when compared to the highly complex scientific theory of the creation of our universe and the Big Bang. But even the Big Bang has a simplistic start. To quote Hawkins in his 1973 book, extrapolation of the expansion of the universe backwards in time using general relativity yields an infinite density and temperature at a finite time in the past. So the Big Bang theory is reverse engineered from the current rules of physics as we observe them now. To continue the quote, this irregular behavior, known as a gravitational singularity, indicates that general relativity is not an adequate description of the laws of physics in this regime. Models based on general relativity alone cannot fully extrapolate towards the singularity. So basically, in the beginning, there's nothing. All matter comes into existence in a way that our current models and understandings of astrophysics, macro, and quantum physics fail to explain. It's a bit more advanced than what's written in Genesis, but it's not really any more correct. So the Big Bang posits an age of the universe somewhere in the realm of 14 billion years, which isn't really commented on anywhere in the Bible. Then we have the Garden of Eden, which may or may not be symbolic of the emergence of consciousness. Following some time afterwards is the Great Flood, and Noah, of which there are several theories. The flood could have been caused by the glacial melts at the end of the last ice age some 12,000 years ago that were estimated to raise sea levels by 130 meters, quite a bit. An asteroid impact possibly 5,000 years ago in the Indian Ocean, or the alleged impacts of the Younger Dryas period. Floods are a common feature in mythology from many cultures in North and South America, in addition to China and Southeast Asia. Suddenly, the myth of Atlantis doesn't seem so far-fetched when you consider how much most societies make settlements near the ocean and what a massive difference 130 meters would have made to the coastline. It's thought that the entire part of Southeast Asia might have been a continent. With those caveats aside, I stand by my assertions that the remainder of the Old Testament from Abraham onward is perfectly believable, especially considering the lack of contradictory archaeological evidence. Now we're going to examine the cycle of civilizations in the Old Testament. All great civilizations fade into the annals of society at one point or another. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's sudden. Whatever led to the civilization's rise departs, and much like a star running out of fuel, it collapses in on itself. Many factors can cause or contribute to the collapse of civilizations. Conquest, economic failures, and climate changes, see the Bronze Age collapse, are most commonly identified in contemporary archaeological theories. In the last few centuries, the decline of once powerful civilizations such as the Portuguese, Spanish, Japanese, and British Empire have occurred, but I would not consider these to be equivalent to the fall of ancient civilizations. When the Western Roman Empire fell, the entire developed world was thrown into decline in all aspects. The relative safety of the Roman Empire provided certainty that allowed for economic prosperity, with cultural and intellectual prosperity following in hot pursuit. Trade routes were no longer safe after the fall, and the protections against regional catastrophe that an international empire offered evaporated. Rome was sacked from a population of about 1 million in 200 AD to about 35,000 in 550 AD, and had not returned to prosperity until the formation of the Catholic Church. Can you imagine how our modern world would collapse if global trade became difficult or impossible? The barbarians that caused the sack of Rome, Visigoths and Ostrogoths, were not by any means remarkable. They were simply another barbarian horde that the Romans had dealt with countless times before. Great civilizations typically face these stresses in their infancy, and these are handled with competent governance and ideological faith. What will a citizen not do for his country when he believes it carries the blessings of the gods? I would instead point to corruption as the leading mechanism for the fall of the Roman Empire. The only thing that can defeat such a powerful civilization is the civilization itself. Victory has defeated you. What constitutes corruption can vary greatly. I generalize it as moral corruption, the loss of faith in the ideological values of the civilization by the citizenry. Civilization requires sacrifice on an individual level for the greater benefit, and the erosion of that justification for self-sacrifice and morality that built crucial institutions of military, justice, and governance is ultimately fatal. At a simple level, if your leaders, or even your neighbor, won't sacrifice self-interest for the greater good of society, why would you do the same? Why should you, a Roman citizen, sacrifice decades of your life expanding and defending the empire if you don't believe you're going to be provided for afterward? The Old Testament warns about the catastrophic consequences of moral corruption, the rise of leaders that adhere to moral commandments, and their eventual decline through moral decay. That moral decay is largely personified as idolatry in the Old Testament, which makes sense when you consider idolatry as the worship of alternative systems of morality and justice. Moral decay is very much a feature in contemporary civilization as well, I would argue. Before we launch into idolatry in the Old Testament, I want to touch briefly on another form of corruption. That's the debasement of currency. The silver content of the denarius, that was the currency of the Roman Empire, was stable from its introduction in the 3rd century BC, but began to decline due to dilution with copper in the 1st century AD. Circulation of the coin increased, and the value declined, also known as inflation. We have this today. It's called quantitative easing, and it's another form of corruption that undermines trust in economic and governmental systems. So, how did we arrive at this moral decay? This degradation is not a singular phenomenon. It occurs in complement with the rise of alternative morality systems. Here I describe these alternative moral systems under the umbrella term of idolatry. What is idolatry? Well, it's worshipping something. What is worship? Do I have to make a statue and bow down to it and pray to it, or does it have a wider definition? We cannot constrain idolatry simply as the worship of weird statues. Idolatry is a word with many symbolic definitions. It can also be classed as the adoption of foreign value systems and practices, something that comes with all religions and ideologies. It's really an act of self-worship at the very heart. Humans create the gods, bestow powers upon them through worship, then ask these deities to provide wish fulfillment services. Usually, the consequences of these belief systems are not immediately apparent. These moral systems did not exist during the rise of the civilization. That is, they are alien in many respects. Civilizations can continue to operate in some fashion with these systems in play, but like erosion under a bridge, things are fine for a while, until suddenly they aren't. Not to say that civilizations cannot be successful under pagan religions of idolatry, for example, the glory of Greece and the grandeur of Rome. All ancient civilizations operated some form of polytheistic religion. They came and went with varying levels of permanence. A civilization can be eternally successful with the right morality, and the kingdom of God serves in an ideological concept of a civilization that exists in the heart of every believer forever. So, when does idolatry first occur? The first time idol worship occurs in the Bible is when Jacob, also known as Israel, returns to Bethel in Genesis 35. Jacob instructs his extended family to get rid of their foreign idols, including his non-Hebrew wives Rachel and Leah, daughters of the wandering Turkey named Laban. He was Anatolian. We'll just call him Turkey. Prior to their travel to his homeland. So, finding his idols missing, Laban gets upset and pursues Jacob. Later in the Old Testament, idolatry is punished severely, but here the guilty escape without even a warning. In the story, the idols and their theft by the two wives may also symbolize reluctance to abandon the familial cultures of their homeland and its people, and it resembles Lot's wife looking back on the town of Sodom during its destruction. Abram may have worshipped other gods prior to being called by the ultimate God, but this isn't explicitly stated in Genesis 12. Just that Abram would have to leave everything familiar behind and leave the city of Ur. Joshua has our back here, though, as in 24:2 he says that Terah, the father of Abraham, worshipped other gods. Now, obviously, Abraham was his name after he met with God, Abram his pre-God name. But let's move on to the real meat here. Idolatry happens quick, and it makes people do crazy things. Moses goes up to get the commandments, comes back down 40 days later, and the Hebrews aren't just worshipping hand-carved rush jobs of idols. They've grown tired of waiting and are actually worshipping golden calves, probably some kind of Egyptian bull god named Apis. Now, me personally, I've done metal casting before, and making a mold and casting molten gold into it, it's not easy to do while you're on the run from the Egyptians in the middle of a desert without a workshop. This would have been a pretty big job. Idols are a major subject of symbolism in the Bible. What crazy things happen during pagan worship? Well, you don't need to look far to find this out. The first thing that springs to mind is human sacrifice, and the most valuable humans of all are children. Animals are usually scarce, but sacrificing humans is by far the biggest sacrifice for someone to make. It's mentioned in the Bible as passing your children through the fire, which is a nice way of describing pitching babies into furnaces. It was practiced by a lot of different pagan religions from South America to Europe. In the Middle East, it was usually to Molech, a bull-type god, or Baal, a god of fertility. Any other evil occult activities aren't hard to imagine from there. The Bible is littered with references to human sacrifice. Kings, Chronicles, and Jeremiah all mention it, whether to Baal or Molech, and it's universally identified as a great way to upset God, a fantastic way to really piss him off. Idolatry, like a case of smallpox, is also highly contagious. You remember that command of God to massacre all the Canaanites? I think it was in Exodus. He wasn't just doing it because they were different. They looked different, or they maybe had a different skin color. No, they were doing some objectively evil religious practices, and God knew that if they weren't wiped out, the Israelites would start doing it too. Lo and behold, he was right. They didn't kill them all, and they all started eventually worshipping idols. When it came to pagan offerings and sacrifice, the more evil the better. Child sacrifice is mentioned as one of the reasons God sent Nebuchadnezzar to punish the Israelites. And that's referenced in 2 Kings and also in Jeremiah. Now wait a minute. Didn't God instruct Abraham to sacrifice his son? Well, he did. He also stopped it just in time, like, oh, bro, I was just joking, man, chill. Give me that ram instead. Now that's an interesting point, and I'll probably discuss that a bit later on. There does seem to be quite a contrast between the God in the Old Testament and the New one, but it's quite a big subject. Now, let's take a look at Sodom and Gomorrah. These two cities were probably late Bronze Age in date, so they were probably established in around the 3rd millennium BC. Speaking of Bronze Age, I would also like to mention the late Bronze Age collapse, a time of extensive societal and population collapse around 1200 BC. These two cities are an excellent example of what can happen when there aren't rules. Sodom. Well, that's where the word sodomy comes from, and if you aren't familiar, go find a dictionary, don't Google it. Gomorrah, well, that kind of sounds like gonorrhea, so bad news all round. These cities were well established before Lot arrived on the scene, so then the two strangers arrive in the city and Lot insists they stay at his house. Later that night, a mob of raging homosexuals start knocking on his door, demanding he turn over the strangers to them. Oops! Turns out they're actually two angels, and suddenly the entire mob goes blind. So, what religion were these cities? Who knows? What we do know is that their lack of sexual morality caused a wider moral collapse, and a meteor, or something similar, wiped them out afterward. How do I know it's a meteor? Well, we know it was the wrath of God, and God likes to personify his wrath in the elements available to him. Maybe a large rock just happened to be in the galactic neighborhood. This reminds me of another story. Similar. The tribe of Benjamin and the town of Gibeah. The Benjamites were known to be fierce warriors on the battlefield, but also seemed to be rather depraved back in their town. Similar to Sodom, they tried to pull the same thing, and the rest of the tribes declared war on them, hearing about what they'd done. And the rest of the tribes, they basically genocide the tribe of Benjamin. They let a few live, which I think also made God unhappy. The parallels between these two stories and what are happening today are quite clear. In the absence of rules and morality, a few perverted activities can rapidly escalate into wholesale worship of lustful instincts, with parallels to idolatry and disastrous results. Currently, we're at the stage of how many gender identities can dance on the head of a penis, but I'll leave you, the audience, to make your own conclusion there. Let's say I've seen some interesting pictures of the strange rituals engaged in with some parties of the rich and famous. Didn't that building on Epstein's Island resemble a Babylonian temple? So we know idolatry is highly contagious, whether it's bull worship or unrestrained expressions of sexual morality, and it rapidly escalates into degenerate and unhealthy rituals. I also want to point out that it seemed to me like in both of these towns, a large amount of the male population turns out to be bisexual or homosexual. Now, that's kind of interesting because obviously these conditions occur to quite a low frequency. I believe it's less than 5%, probably more like 1% of the population is actually naturally homosexual. So it's kind of telling that it goes from being 1% to maybe like 20 or 30 or 50% in these stories. We're not actually sure, but it seems to be quite a few of the men are homosexuals in these stories. So sexual morality is quite the topic of contention in modern civilization. Proponents advocate that love is love, anything is permissible between consenting adults. The advent of contraception and antibiotics and the monumental shift of the definition of sexual morality have largely liberated the masses from the constraints on sexual promiscuity. Let us consider, for example, how changes to sexual morality impacted ancient civilizations in the Bible. Two stories come to mind regarding the consequences of sexual immorality in the Bible. First, the adventures of Lot in the city of Sodom that we just discussed, and second, the sexual transgressions of the warlike tribe of Benjamin in the town of Gibeah. The descent of these peoples into sexual immorality is not discussed in depth, but what we do know is the ultimate outcome is rabid hypersexuality culminating in the male inhabitants of these towns demanding to have their way with the sojourning travelers, regardless of their gender. Did rainbow flags exist in the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah? Maybe we should look into that. Fairly early in the Old Testament, at the third book, Leviticus provides a laundry list of immoral sexual acts, including but not limited to carnal relations between women and animals, I think horses, relations between men, relatives, and even children. There's two conclusions to make from this. Unnatural sexual relations were common enough, and the consequence of said acts serious enough to warrant the production of a specific no bueno list quite early in the Bible. You, the reader, as an evidently self-aware human, will understand the strength of sexual impulse. What you may not understand is the mechanism of descent into sexual depravity and sexual immorality. Does it not strike anyone as strange that the entire male population of these towns became hyperactive bisexuals? What could have caused this? Is it observed in any other civilization? So now we shall examine a great and powerful civilization that features later in the Bible. This civilization also provided a pivotal role in the spread of Christianity through the establishment of ancient highways and trade routes and protection of these trade routes. It's none other than the magnificent Roman Empire. What is handy about the Roman Empire is its promulgation of rather useful historical records. In these records, sexual liberation appears to have impacted the fertility of the Roman Empire severely enough that the Emperor Augustus enacted legislation to penalize the unmarried and childless in about 18 BC. Augustus is reported to have blamed moral decay of Roman society and most tellingly sexual liberation of Roman women as the cause of these declining birth rates. In Rome, sexual morality was defined as the ability to produce more Roman children to expand the empire. However, by the turn of the millennium, sexual morality was beginning to turn inward, away from producing progeny to that of self-indulgence. If your main goal is hedonistic self-gratification, you may be able to understand why children could interfere with that. With birth rates falling across the developed world, it truly begs the question, are we repeating the same mistakes of these ancient civilizations? As another contemporary philosopher puts it, we as a society are too preoccupied with how many sexual identities can dance on the head of a penis. Sexual fulfillment is a major concern for people with modern civilization. It is ever-present thought for many, and no matter how much action they get, they're never satisfied. With the amount of time it spends in the minds of our youth, it starts to sound like worship, does it not? Anyway, with that tangent complete, I think it's probably time to conclude this essay. We're now approaching 6,000 words, and I think it's time to stop the rant and get back to actual research. As much as I enjoy baseless speculations, I need some more data. I'm currently embarking on a long and arduous journey in an attempt to speed run all the books I should have read when I was younger. I'm hitting Young, Evola, the Greek classical texts, and other certified gold works. As I get new ideas, I'll commit them to paper. Thanks for listening.